Hello, everyone, and welcome back to MI for Change. I am your host, Dr. Monica Gilbert, and today we're going to talk about these foundational skills of motivational interviewing. I like to think about these foundational skills as the tools to your toolbox. So, this is where we get really crafty. This is where I start giving you examples, real techniques that you can use. Now, in a lot of the literature, you will naturally see it as the OARS, OARS. But in other literature, you will also see the added I. So it looks like OARS plus I. Since I love to give you guys all of the information and I just partial info, I'm going to also share what that I stands for. As you already know, and if you don't know, you've probably perceived already from my other podcast that motivational interviewing tends to use a lot of acronyms. And that way, like these little skills kind of stick better. All right, so let's go over the very first one, which is O. So O stands for open-ended questions. In contrary to closed-ended questions, when you ask an open-ended question, naturally the person tends to elaborate and give you more information. Also, if you are meeting a client for the first time, you should be using more of the open-ended question because that allows for more of this rapport building. I think about closed-ended questions like if you're doing an interview, right, and you're asking like very basic questions and you just need a response or you need the data and that's it, that's when you would use the closed ended questions. But if you really want more elaboration, you want to build more of a connection, you should be using more open ended question. And oftentimes it's hard to use because in this society where everything is going on so quickly and when we want answers right away, we naturally just use close-ended questions, which tells us a little bit about the society we're living in now, but that's a topic for another conversation. So open-ended questions, again, allows us to get that elaboration. The trick to asking an open-ended question is that you have to already anticipate that the response will be an open ended response. For example, if I say something like, how are you? Now, the person, I think most people would just say, I'm doing well, I'm doing okay. Very few people will actually elaborate. So I asked this question and I got a close ended response. So this question functions as a close ended question because I got a close ended response. If I want to ask an open ended question, instead of saying, how are you? I would say something like, tell me a little bit more about your day. Just by saying, tell me a little bit more, you all of a sudden get a lot of elaboration and you get an open ended response. So if you want to start using open-ended question, always anticipate that the response will be an open-ended response. That's how you don't get kind of like, you fall into asking the close-ended question when you think it's an open-ended one. So that's what an open-ended question is. And then it encourages further exploration, further also meaning into the conversation. And if you know that the client that you're working with tends to go on tangents and you lose them very quickly because they go on and on, you may not use that many open ended questions during your session. Again, these are just techniques. You have to adapt them to your communication style so it doesn't come off as not authentic. And you also want to adapt them to the client that you're working with. Okay, so that is open-ended question. The next one is affirmation. So O is for open-ended, A is for affirmation. So affirmation is not only the cheerleader in us. We're not just saying, wow, you're doing so awesome. Just like if you're working with a child, you wouldn't just say, good job, good job, good job. You want to make sure that you are specific on what they're doing that is a good job. Affirmations are the same way. What you're doing is that you're highlighting client strengths. Maybe it's something that they overcame. Maybe it's a decision they made. Maybe they know how to find resources very quickly. Whatever it is, you want to point that out. So in motivational interviewing, they say something like, you're going to put it in a platter and then serve it to them. So that is what an affirmation is. So the first thing is that you have to pick what these strengths are. And after you pick them, just like if you're picking flowers, you're going to put it in a bouquet and then you're going to give it back to the client. Obviously, this is a metaphor. But yes, so you're going to use affirmations that way. A good example of an affirmation is saying something like, I've seen how hard that behavior is, and you've been working really hard to get rid of it. Something along those lines. Or I can tell that you have great ideas about this. Or I can really see your efforts, even though you're experiencing an extinction burst or whatever it is that you're experiencing. Solely saying that really makes the difference. So, affirmations are really important to incorporate during your sessions. When I've had these conferences that I've been invited to go speak and everything, I always like to ask the audience. I always like to collect data, right? That helps me in future presentations as well. But I like to ask the audience which of the OARS is the one that they find the most difficult. And oftentimes I hear affirmations. And I remember I asked a therapist one time and I said, why affirmations? Isn't that what we do all the time? And this therapist has only worked with kids. So she told me, well, yes, but I feel like it's not genuine. Like when I do it to the parent, I feel like I'm just like coming off as non genuine. And I said, well, if you are, don't do it because it is going to look weird and non genuine. So again, it's about looking for these trends. And for some clients that we're going to work with, I'll say it, I'll put it out there. You're going to have to dig deep, 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 deep to try to find those trends. But I promise you that they are there. We just have to, I think, become better at trying identifying what these strengths are. All right, so those are affirmations. Let's go to the next one, and the next one is reflection or reflective listening. And if you've ever taken a counseling course before, you probably have spoken about this, or the professor has spoken about reflections. So reflections are, I feel like they're the piece of motivational interviewing that is the most like therapist kind, if that makes sense. Like this is the one we see in movies and things like that. So reflection is exactly what it sounds like. Like when you're reflecting in front of a mirror, you see your reflection. So you're going to say exactly what the client is saying, you're going to reiterate it, or you're going to infer what they're saying. And a lot of the times it's looking under the waterline. So what are they implying? What are they nonverbals? What am I seeing? They're saying this, but I'm seeing this. So pointing out those things in a reflection. There's different types and different degrees of reflections. It can be very basic or it can be more complex, like double-sided reflections and amplified reflections. Those are more complex reflections. Okay, so reflections. So you're reflecting exactly what the client is saying. However, you want to make sure that you don't sound like a parrot, that you sound like a person. And again, it's all about being genuine and using these techniques. That's why in the beginning, I told you guys, you have to adapt it to your own style of communication. So it just comes off more naturally. For example, if a client tells you, oh, I'm just so tired of dealing with these behaviors, I can't put up with it anymore, I would probably reflect by saying, it sounds like this makes you really frustrated and you wish you had a better way of dealing with these behaviors. Okay, so that is a reflection. A double-sided reflection, which is more of a complex reflection, you're going to reflect what the client says, and you always want to end it with the argument towards change. And in the middle of the double-sided reflection, you're going to say and instead of but. If you say but, it's not the end of the world, but just know that you should say and. For example, you mentioned that those behaviors that you see in your son are not bothering you at all because he's going to grow out of it. And you also mentioned that you haven't been able to go to your favorite restaurant for over a month because of these behaviors. So I'm pointing out both sides of it. And what I'm doing is that I'm pointing out the client's ambivalence, which again, ambivalence is normal. We'll talk a little bit more about ambivalence, but ambivalence is a natural state that we all have. So what I'm doing is that I'm pointing it out. I'm saying, that's okay. This is what I hear. But again, I'm ending it with that argument towards change, because what I am predicting or what I'm trying to evoke is for the client to then respond and say, yeah, we haven't really been to a restaurant for over a month and I love that restaurant. I should really try to like tackle these behaviors now. And that's what we want to hear. We want to hear change talk. All right, so those are reflections. I went over double sided reflection, and the next complex reflection is amplified reflection. Amplified is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to the extreme. So the reason why we try to go to the extreme is because we want the client to then come back to the middle. For example, let's say a teacher says, those studies on behavior analysis don't prove anything at all. I would say something like, it's really hard to see that these studies make sense in the real life. You don't believe any of this at all. So saying something like this can backfire. They may say like, yep, that's what I said. Or they may start engaging in change talk. They may respond by saying, well, I guess I wouldn't say at all. I'm sure that some studies have good evidence or whatever. So that's basically what it looks like. It's going to the extreme just so the client can maybe come to the middle. And that's what we're hoping for. So that's an amplified reflection, which is another type of reflection. I have a funny joke, or a funny, not a joke, a story about reflection. So I was invited to go speak at HABA, which is Hawaii ABA. I know, super big deal. I was ecstatic. But, anyways, so I went there and I was in the bus coming back to our hotel after the conference with Matt. If you don't know him, he's really big in the ethics world. So we were coming back to the hotel and he asked me, he says, well, I know you came with your husband. What are you guys doing tonight? And I'm like, oh, we're going to probably go to dinner somewhere in Hawaii, whatever. And then I asked him and I said, what are you doing with your wife tonight? And he's like, you know what? I think we're going to go uh, to a topless bar. And I'm like, a topless bar? And, I didn't say it right away, but I thought about it and I was like, oh my gosh, a topless bar. And of course, I hear something, it processes it really quickly, and then I say it right back. And thank God I did, because we were in a bus full of people. And I look at him and I'm like, you said a topless bar? And he looked at me, he said, no, I said a tapas bar. I just have this Midwestern accent. And I'm like, oh, a tapas bar. So that was funny. Everyone laughed. Everything was like not as awkward as it seems right now when I'm retelling the story. And what was interesting is that he said, well, thank goodness that you asked me to reiterate what you heard, because if not, you would have thought that I was going somewhere, when I wasn't, which is, if you want to go to a topless bar, it's fine. But this is just like the moral of the story. That's why reflections are so important, because sometimes we're delivering information, we're giving clients information, or they're telling us information, and we think that we hear something. And when we reflect back, they correct us and they say, no, that's not what I meant at all. And that's absolutely okay. I'd rather them correct me than me leave with the wrong information in mind. So that's how reflections also work. They also help the client feel heard, understood. And I think for a lot of us that have ADHD, and I'll put it out there, and have some difficulties concentrating, using reflections keeps us in the conversation, because we know that we have to reflect. So when I'm thinking, okay, I have to listen, because that way I can reflect something that makes sense, not something like out of the norm, then I stay more focused on that conversation. So I think it helps in that as well. All right, so enough about reflections. Let's go into summarization. So again, summarization is exactly what it sounds like. You are connecting things, you're bringing them together, all the information, and then you're inviting for the next session. So you may say something like, Thank you very much for coming today. Let me just reiterate some of the important points that we spoke about. You mentioned little Tommy is having difficulties at school. You would like to work on those behaviors. You also mentioned that you don't have enough time to work on them. You mentioned that a barrier is the father who doesn't stick with the intervention. And you also mentioned you wanted more parent coaching session to include the father, and we can all have, that conversation together. Is that correct? So you always want to ask to check in and see if what you mentioned and is correct, and then ask, is there anything else I left out? And then finally, what would you like to speak about during our next session? Summarizations can also work by redirecting the conversation. We know that sometimes clients that we're working with tend to start speaking about something random or something else, and we have to bring them back. So instead of just like forcing a U-turn on them or redirecting them, you want to summarize what you already heard so they feel not dismissed, and that you're listening to them, and then say, okay, is it okay if we start talking about this topic? They say yes, and then naturally, very nicely, you flow into that. As you can see, as I'm starting to talk about these different techniques, and I even feel it, I feel like I'm dancing. So that's really what motivational interviewing is like. You shouldn't feel like every conversation you have is an arm wrestle. It should feel like you're dancing, like you're dancing. Everything should flow. All right, so those are summarizations. You can use them again at the end of your session or to redirect to another point. And now let's get into the plus I. We already went over the OARS, and now the plus I. So the I is for information and advice giving. So again, a myth of motivational interviewing is that we as speakers tend to never confront the client, tend to not give advice or recommendation, or sometimes we just don't tell them our concerns. And that is completely false. We do that all the time. We just do it in a way that works. So in information exchange, it used to be called the EPE approach. In the older literature from Miller and Rolnick, you'll see it as the EPE approach, which is elicit, provide, elicit. Now it's called the AOA approach, which is ask, offer, ask. And I think this is a much easier way to remember it because it just makes more sense. So again, we're going to tell the parents are concerned, we're going to provide correct information. And I love, 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 love this technique because it allows you to provide that information while still respecting client autonomy, giving them only the information they need to know. So that's great for burnout or to decrease burnout. And you're not saying the same thing over and over and over. Okay. So let me show you guys how this technique works. So let's say, and I'll give you a real life example. I had a parent, I'm going to say like maybe a year ago, that came in. And this is when the whole thing about ABA being abused started and all that. So the parent comes in and they're like, oh, I've heard really good things about you, about your company, this and that. But I don't know about ABA because I've heard that it's abusive, and I've done some of my research and I've seen some videos and all that. So the BCBA in me wanted to come out and say, well, we do ABA differently. This is the way that we do it, modern ABA, blah, blah. Give her all this information that she probably was not even ready or willing to hear. Instead, I put on my MI crown, as I say, and I began to speak with a parent. And the first thing I did was ask what they already knew. So in the AOA, the first one is A for ask. So I asked them and I said, well, Mom, tell me a little bit about what you've heard about ABA. I'm curious to know. And she went on and she told me everything. She showed me websites, pictures, just everything. And I said, okay, thank you so much for sharing that with me. Now, is it okay if I tell you a little bit about the way that we do ABA here or the way that I see ABA working with your child? So that is the offer part. So I'm offering information, but with permission. So I asked her, is it okay? And sometimes permission is already given. So sometimes a parent just says naturally, like, this is what I've heard, but I want to hear from you. Okay, you don't have to ask for permission again. But in this situation, she didn't say that. So I asked for permission and she said, yeah, of course, sure, you can share that with me. And I shared with her how we do ABA. And then the last part is ask again, because you want to make sure that the information that you provided to the parent is the information that you want them to hear, to process. So after I said, what did you understand from that information that I just shared with you? And then she let me know. We corrected a few things, and that was the conversation. So again, I shared what I wanted to share, but I did it in a way that was respectful. I asked for permission, and I'm sure that she was more willing to take this information because it didn't come off as unsolicited. I think about this in a really, I know it's going to be like a really weird way, but I think about it like, those old movies of vampires where before the vampire enters your house, you have to say, come into my house. If not, the vampire can't come in. So that's sort of like how that works. Once you ask for permission and the parent grants you the permission, or the client, parent or client, they are more likely to listen to what you're going to say. So that is the OARS plus I. And something interesting about the OARS plus I is that in the following videos, I'll speak a little bit about the 4 processes of motivational interviewing. And it's going to be interesting to see how you would use the OARS. For example, the open-ended questions, you would use it differently when you're evoking than when you're engaging, or when you're doing the other phases of the 4 processes. So if you become really tactful and good in using the OARS, you can use them in different phases depending on what your goal is. Let me give you guys a quick sneak peek. So if you're trying to engage with clients, you're building that rapport, you would use open-ended question to become curious, to collect baseline data. So you would ask a little bit more about them. You would do things more like that. If you're in the preparation phase, or if you're more in the evoking phase, which is already where you want them to come up with the intervention, you would ask the open-ended question in a way where you're evoking this information from them, but in terms of the goals. You want them to problem solve. You want them to think about strategies. You want them to strategize and then give it to you. So you would ask different types of open-ended questions in that phase. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You will know more about it during the 4 processes of motivational interviewing. As always, I hope that you found value in all this information, that you're able to apply at least one thing. Leave a comment, send me a message. I love to hear from you guys, and I will see you next time. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of MI for Change. If you're ready to keep growing your motivational interviewing skills, I'd love to invite you to explore my MI Academy, where you'll find a full library of on-demand courses designed to help you put MI into practice with confidence. You can learn more at www.drmonicagilbert.com. Until next time, keep asking the questions that spark